There comes a moment in every dynamic where words lose their power, where constant explanations, repeated reassurances, and endless emotional effort stop having any impact. That moment is when silence takes the stage and everything begins to shift. For so long, you might have been the one reaching out, initiating conversations, bridging gaps, softening misunderstandings, and holding the emotional weight of the connection together. You thought that if you just tried a little harder, explained a little clearer, or loved a little deeper, something in them would open up. You were the emotional engine, driving the connection forward even when they kept their foot lightly on the brake. But when you finally stop pushing, when you simply withdraw your effort without resentment, the entire energy between you changes. Silence has a weight of its own, and that weight begins to settle on the avoidant's shoulders in ways they never expected. An avoidant often becomes comfortable in a pattern where your presence is guaranteed. They may not fully engage, but they've grown used to knowing that you'll always be there to fill the empty spaces, to keep the connection alive even when they're distant. Your words, your attention, and your persistence created a kind of safety net beneath them. Even if they didn't reciprocate emotionally, they subconsciously counted on your energy to maintain the bond. But silence cuts through that unspoken arrangement like nothing else can. Suddenly, there's no message waiting for them, no gentle nudge, no warm presence reaching out to bridge the emotional distance. What was once predictable is now uncertain, and in that uncertainty, they begin to feel the absence they once dismissed. This power shift isn't about playing games or trying to manipulate outcomes. It's about what naturally happens when someone who has been overextending finally brings their energy back to themselves. The avoidant is forced to confront a reality where your efforts are no longer cushioning their detachment. They can no longer lean on your predictable pursuit to maintain a sense of control. Silence exposes the imbalance that words often cover up. It highlights exactly how much of the connection relied on your consistent emotional labor. In that quiet, something subtle but profound happens. The avoidant begins to sense the void where your presence used to be. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's deeply unsettling. For perhaps the first time, they have to sit with their own feelings without the distraction of your efforts to fix, chase, or prove. The silence you hold becomes a mirror, reflecting back to them the emotional space they created. And while they may not admit it openly, this sudden shift unsettles their sense of control and predictability. What was once taken for granted is now gone, and the absence itself begins to speak louder than any confrontation ever could. Your quiet withdrawal carries a strength that no explanation could ever match, and in that strength, the entire dynamic subtly but powerfully transforms. Avoidant individuals often build emotional dynamics that rely on predictability more than they rely on depth. They may keep their distance, appear emotionally unavailable, or give mixed signals, yet beneath that surface is a quiet expectation that you will keep showing up. Your pursuit becomes the constant rhythm they unconsciously depend on. Every time you send a message after they've gone quiet, every time you forgive without real change, every time you make the first move to repair a rift, you confirm a pattern they've grown accustomed to. This predictability gives them a sense of safety, not the warm, vulnerable kind, but a controlled, detached safety where they don't have to risk emotional openness while still reaping the benefits of your consistent presence. Your pursuit makes it easy for them to maintain their distance because they know you'll close the gap for them. For many avoidants, emotional closeness can feel overwhelming. It challenges their sense of independence and triggers their fear of being engulfed or losing control. So, they create distance to protect themselves, sometimes without fully realizing the impact it has on the other person. But when they do this repeatedly, a rhythm forms. They pull away, you follow. They go silent, you reach out. They give half-hearted effort, and you give double to keep things afloat. Over time, this rhythm becomes a kind of emotional contract, unspoken yet powerful. The avoidant gets to keep their walls up, and you keep chipping away at them, believing that persistence will eventually earn connection. In reality, what it earns is their comfort with a dynamic where they can remain emotionally guarded without ever facing the consequences of that distance. They thrive in this predictability because it shields them from emotional responsibility. If they know you will always take the first step, they never have to confront their own fear of closeness or their reluctance to be emotionally available. Your efforts create a cushion that allows them to retreat whenever they want, knowing the connection won't truly disappear. They become accustomed to the idea that no matter how far they pull away, you'll be there to reel things back in. It's not always a conscious manipulation. Often it's a subconscious reliance. But this reliance is exactly what makes your eventual silence so impactful. When you stop chasing the predictable rhythm they depended on is disrupted. They're no longer the one in control of the pace because the pattern that allowed them to feel safe without engaging has been broken. They may not even understand at first why it feels unsettling, but the absence of your pursuit removes the structure they had unconsciously built the connection around. This is when their inner world begins to shift. The very thing they took for granted, the security of your continued efforts, disappears, and for perhaps the first time, they're forced to experience the emotional uncertainty that you've been living in all along. Their comfort was never about closeness, it was about control. And when that control is no longer reinforced by your predictable pursuit, it leaves a void they didn't prepare for. When you decide to step back, not out of frustration, but out of clarity, something profound happens that words alone could never create. For so long, the avoidant has operated under an unspoken illusion of control. They believed that they could decide the pace, determine when to be close and when to retreat, and that no matter what, you would adjust accordingly. This belief gave them a subtle sense of power, a quiet assurance that the connection was on their terms. Every time they pulled away and you reached out, that belief was reinforced. They felt they could keep you within emotional reach without ever having to fully engage. But when you no longer participate in that dynamic, when you stop making the effort to close the emotional distance, the foundation of that illusion starts to crumble. Silence and withdrawal from your side aren't just the absence of words, they're the removal of the invisible structure that allowed them to stay detached without consequence. It forces them to confront the reality that the connection wasn't running on autopilot, it was running on your energy. Without your continuous input, their sense of control begins to falter. They can no longer predict your response because there isn't one. They can't rely on your reassurance because it's no longer being offered. This is often the first moment they experience a kind of emotional disorientation. The power they thought they had wasn't real power. It was borrowed from your willingness to keep showing up. In this space, the avoidant is faced with the truth they've long avoided. Control was never theirs to begin with. They were merely benefiting from your emotional investment, mistaking it for their ability to dictate the terms. Once that investment is withdrawn, they have no structure left to lean on. It's like pulling the plug from a machine that's been humming for years. Suddenly the hum stops, and the silence is deafening. What was once predictable now feels unstable. This is where their illusion shatters, not through confrontation, but through the quiet strength of your absence. This shift can be deeply unsettling for someone who has built emotional safety around distance. Without your pursuit, they are left alone with their own emotional landscape, which they've spent so much time avoiding. The certainty that they could always have access to you, even while keeping their walls intact, dissolves. It's not about punishing them. It's about revealing the truth of the dynamic. Your silence doesn't attack their control. It exposes that it never truly existed. And in that exposure, they often feel something they've managed to keep at bay for a long time: vulnerability. It creeps in, not through your words, but through the undeniable reality that their perceived grip on the connection was sustained by your efforts all along. When you finally stop trying, something almost paradoxical happens. The emotional roles reverse. For so long, you were the one who felt the sting of emotional distance, the ache of unanswered messages, the confusion of mixed signals, and the quiet rejection that comes from someone who never fully lets you in. You carried the weight of uncertainty, wondering if your efforts would ever be met with equal energy. You tolerated cold silences, waiting for warmth that often arrived too late or not at all. But when you pull back, not in bitterness, but with calm finality, the avoidant is confronted with a feeling they never thought they'd experience. They begin to feel what you once felt. The rejection they quietly delivered through their detachment returns to them in a way that's subtle, unexpected, and far more powerful than any direct confrontation. Your absence doesn't just create a gap, it reflects their own behavior back to them. The very moments where they went silent and expected you to reach out are now mirrored in their reality. They wait, perhaps out of habit, for the familiar sign that you're still there, still holding on. But this time it doesn't come. The longer the silence stretches, the more it unsettles them. What was once their comfort zone, emotional distance, now becomes the source of their discomfort. It's no longer you sitting with the unease of not knowing it's them. That subtle shift creates a powerful emotional echo, one they didn't anticipate when they thought they could keep you within reach without fully engaging. Avoidants often believe that keeping someone at a distance protects them from pain, but when the dynamic flips, they're faced with a kind of rejection that doesn't come with explanations. There are no emotional outbursts, no desperate pleas, no arguments to reassure them of their importance. There's only stillness, and that stillness forces them to confront their own emotional vulnerabilities, often for the first time in the connection. The coldness they once handed out without much thought is now the same coldness they must sit in. But unlike you, who endured it while holding on to hope, they experience it without the comfort of knowing someone else will close the gap. This reversal isn't dramatic or loud. It creeps in slowly, almost unnoticed at first. But as time passes and your absence remains consistent, it begins to sink in. They start to recognize that the emotional security they felt wasn't built on their effort, but on yours. And now, with that gone, the reality they created for you becomes their own. It's a powerful emotional mirror. The rejection they subtly inflicted through their avoidance is now delivered through your quiet detachment. This time, it's not because you're unavailable emotionally, but because you've chosen to no longer invest where there's no equal return. And that choice, silent as it is, often hits deeper than any words ever could. Throughout the entire dynamic, your energy has been the invisible force holding everything together. It's easy to underestimate just how much of the connection was sustained not by mutual effort, but by your consistent emotional investment. You were the one initiating conversations, soothing tensions, offering understanding, and making space for their emotional hesitations. You filled in the blanks when they went quiet. You carried the weight when they withdrew. You kept the connection alive during stretches where their contribution was minimal. Your presence acted as the emotional glue that held both sides together, even when it felt like you were holding it alone. For the avoidant, this often goes unnoticed. They become accustomed to the idea that the bond simply exists, as if it's self-sustaining. They don't see that it's your energy, your persistence, your emotional generosity that's been keeping everything from falling apart. This dynamic creates an imbalance where one person gives and holds, while the other hovers at a distance, relying on that giving without fully acknowledging it. Every time you chose patience over resentment, every time you extended compassion when they shut down, every time you made the effort to reconnect after emotional gaps, you were laying another invisible thread between you. Those threads wove the fabric of the connection, delicate but strong because they were consistently reinforced by your actions. Meanwhile, the avoidant leaned on that fabric without ever considering what would happen if those threads stopped being woven. It gave them the luxury of detachment because they could trust that you would keep bridging the emotional divide. When you stop trying, those threads are no longer being reinforced. The emotional structure that once held the bond together begins to loosen. At first, it's subtle, a message not sent, a reassurance not offered, a silence that lingers longer than usual. But slowly, the absence of your effort reveals just how much of the relationship depended on it. The avoidant, who once believed the connection was stable even with their distance, begins to feel the shift. The glue that held everything together starts to dissolve, and without your consistent energy, the gaps widen. What once felt effortless to them now feels fragile because the weight of maintaining the connection has shifted back to where it always should have been on both sides. This is often when the avoidant begins to feel an unfamiliar sense of instability. For so long, they were able to retreat emotionally without fear of losing the bond because you were there to hold it up. But now, with your energy redirected toward yourself, the cracks become visible. They may not immediately recognize it as your withdrawal, but they sense something vital is missing. The ease they took for granted is gone, replaced by a subtle but growing tension. The bond they assumed was naturally strong reveals itself as something that required continuous care that you were providing all along. It's in this space that they're forced to confront how much they relied on your effort to maintain something they never fully nurtured themselves. There comes a point where words lose their impact and actions speak volumes, and nothing communicates more powerfully than the decision to simply walk away. Not with anger, not with dramatic announcements, but with quiet certainty. When you stop trying, your silence becomes louder than any speech, and your absence becomes a declaration that can't be ignored. For the avoidant, who has become accustomed to your pursuit, this shift lands with unexpected weight. They were used to having emotional control without fully participating. They relied on your persistence to keep the connection alive. But when you step back, without bitterness or explanations, the message is clear: you will no longer invest where your efforts aren't valued. This is not a threat or a tactic. It's a natural consequence of reclaiming your energy. Walking away in this way carries a unique power because it's rooted in self-respect rather than reaction. You're not trying to make them see your worth, you're embodying it. There's no need for ultimatums, no long speeches about what they did or didn't do. The absence of your energy speaks for itself. For someone who has lived in the comfort of knowing you'll always reach out, this silence disrupts their emotional certainty. The pattern they've relied on has been broken, and in its place is an unsettling stillness. It's in this stillness that they begin to feel the impact of what's truly been lost. This kind of departure is often the most jarring for avoidance because it doesn't give them the emotional cues they've grown used to. They're not met with pleas or confrontations, they're met with nothing. And nothing is hard to rationalize away. When you used to express hurt or disappointment, they could retreat further into their avoidance, convincing themselves that your emotions were something to manage from afar. But when you stop expressing and instead remove yourself, there's no emotional noise for them to hide behind. Your silence forces them to confront the reality of the connection without the filter of your efforts. What makes walking away so powerful is that it reverses the emotional dynamic entirely. For so long, your actions revolved around their inconsistency, their distance, their emotional rhythms. Now it's their turn to feel the unpredictability. The security blanket of your consistent presence is gone, and they're left in a space where the only thing that remains is the consequence of their own choices. They may not immediately understand what's happening, but the absence lingers in their mind. Every moment of silence is a reminder that something foundational has shifted. The avoidant often believes they are the ones who hold the power because they control their availability. But when you walk away with quiet strength, that belief crumbles. They begin to realize that the true anchor of the connection was never their distance. It was your presence. By removing that presence, you create a void that no explanation can fill. Your decision to stop trying becomes the clearest, most undeniable statement of self-worth, one that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood.